All right. Well, we'll go ahead and kick it off, and if others come in a little bit late, that's okay. So welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Alyson Lipsky, and in this session, I'm going to be speaking with you about a scorecard we developed to look at the integration of gender and governance. Now, as we know, family planning and gender equality are critical for promoting sustainable health and development outcomes. Achieving gender equality requires a whole of government commitment with effective mechanisms in place that can translate policies into results. For health issues such as family planning and maternal and child health, a gender lens that enables decision and policymakers and advocates to understand the impact of gender relations, norms, and inequalities on family planning and maternal and child health is critical. This gender lens is critical not only in understanding the underlying gender barriers that influence outcomes, but also in thinking about how relevant governance structures and processes reinforce or disrupt gender norms and inequalities. These decision-making programming structures ultimately dictate the shape of policy and program specifics. And because we have such a small group today, what I'd like to do is to ask everyone to go off mute. And I'll just ask you guys a quick question, which is, what do you think of when you hear gender and governance? And if you're not comfortable unmuting and responding to the question, please go ahead and enter into the chat your response. What do you think of when you hear gender and governance? And I'll just wait a few seconds and see if anyone wants to dive into that one.
I'll give it a shot. Hi, this is Courtney Bickert. I used to work at
Hi.
many years ago. I was there in the predecessors to help to the policy project, as well as policy. I'm just coming off the cuff of this, but when I think of governance and gender, I think of governance, the underlying sort of foundation for what then results in however gender is treated positively or negatively, and the culture that results and the actions that recall. So that's what I think of as governance is the foundation.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's great for off the cuff. Well done. Anyone else want to add a different component or a different thought? Well, the reason I asked that question is that we had to ask that question. We had to figure out, when you're developing a scorecard, ideally you should know what you're scoring, right? So we had to figure this out. And we knew that we wanted to take a comprehensive view of governance. And so we based the scorecard on the health governance triangle, which defines a health system as being comprised of three major groups of stakeholders: the state, clients and citizens, and providers, and the relationships between them. Each group of stakeholders will ideally fulfill certain roles and responsibilities. The government is meant to provide directives, oversight, and resources to providers, while providers are meant to provide information, report on activities, and advocate to the government. Providers are also supposed to offer services to clients and citizens, while those clients and citizens are meant to provide input and feedback to providers and feedback on those services. So clients and citizens are also supposed to be able to voice their concerns to government through voting, advocacy, participation in policy and goal setting processes, and the government is meant to respond to citizen voice. Now, because these stakeholders serve these same functions, even when looking at a subset of the health system, this triangle can also be applied to FPRH MCH policies and programs specifically. Therefore, to assess the integration of gender into the governance of FPRH MCH policies and programs, the scorecard assesses how well gender is integrated across the triangle, so among the stakeholders and their relationships. 3 steps comprised our approach. The first was to develop the scorecard, then to apply it and analyze the data and assess whether the scorecard actually provided the answers we hoped it would. And then we needed to revise it and disseminate it. So to develop the scorecard, HP Plus staff first conducted a desk review of existing gender scorecards, governance scorecards, and other relevant monitoring tools and specific gender-related indicators. From the desk review, HP Plus compiled a list of draft areas of inquiry organized according to the governance triangle. HP Plus then convened an expert consultation, bringing in voices from academia, local partners, implementing partners, and donors with expertise in gender and governance to provide further guidance. Based on the desk review and outcomes from the expert consultation, HP Plus developed the first draft of the scorecard indicators. So with this draft scorecard in hand, HP Plus identified 3 local consultants to apply the scorecard in Rwanda, Senegal, and Tanzania based on the availability of gender-related data in each country and their commitment to gender as stated in available policy and strategy documents. The 3 consultants worked independently to complete the scorecards in their respective countries, both through desk review and validating with select stakeholders where needed. After receiving the completed scorecards, we worked with the consultants to develop the analysis methodology and analyze the data. The results from Rwanda and Senegal were presented at working group meetings in each country. And based on the experience of applying the scorecard, we revised it. This included revising some of the indicators, a lot of the instructions and guidance, and writing up the suggested approach to analyzing the data. Now, in an ideal world, gender would be addressed by all stakeholders within each of the roles and responsibilities that the triangle delineates. So the scorecard is divided into 3 sections, which are then further divided into subsections. The state section assesses whether regulations, policies, and strategies lay the foundation so that gender can be or is adequately integrated into direction and oversight of FPRH-MCH policies and programs, and whether there is a regulatory and policy framework in place that requires the state to respond to gender-related FPRH-MCH needs that are voiced by clients and citizens. Very much that foundation work that Courtney was talking about earlier. And the section on clients and citizens assesses whether they have representation in key decision-making platforms and are gender inclusive themselves. Now, you'll note that this section only has 2 subsections, and this is because we were designing something that needed to be able to be completed with existing data. And we found through our desk review that there really weren't enough consistent data sources across countries that look at other factors regarding citizen or civil society engagement in gender policy and governance issues. The section on providers assesses whether they are required to provide information, report, and advocate to government about gender-related issues and whether they incorporate gender concerns into FPRH-MCH guidance around service provision. So here are a couple examples of the indicators that are included in the scorecard. Both of these come from the state section. These indicators are designed to be answered through a desk review of any existing materials, and these can include policy and strategy documents, HMIS data sets, and anything else that is publicly available. There are 2 possible scoring mechanisms, as you'll see here, that depend on the indicator. If the indicator simply asks if a provision or policy exists, then the response is a simple yes or no. If the indicator asks about the degree to which something exists or is in place, then respondents can select either low, medium, or high. The scorecard further asks for justification for each score and provides guidance on what to specifically look for. The analysis is meant to be completed in Excel and provides a summary score per section and subsection, though in my personal opinion, it's the subsection scores that are most useful and interesting. In the scorecard, we provide a suggested approach to analyzing the scores. We provide sample scoring sheets to be transferred to Excel that anyone can use to produce the summary scores. Here we provided an example of the scores that came out of the application in one of the countries, country A, for the subsections within the state. The state section of the scorecard is the largest section, and you can see it's divided further into 6 subsections. Looking at the data in this way helps to identify gaps in policy and some in implementation. The scores are all out of 10. So with this, you can see that country A scores quite high in a number of these subsections, but there are gaps around complaint and appeal mechanisms around gender, the use of gender data and analyses and access to data, and gender components of key FPRH-MCH policies. Now, you can imagine that with these scores, stakeholders might choose to do a deeper dive on each of those gap areas, these complaint or appeal mechanisms, indicators under gender components of key policies, or those indicators under gender data and analyses and access to data to get a better sense of where the specific gaps are. Let's say in another country B, if they scored very low on representation of women and marginalized people on decision-making bodies, or perhaps on the whole of government strategy subsections, you can imagine that stakeholders would home in on those areas as opportunities for improvement. So we've learned a lot from simply developing and trying out the scorecard. First and foremost, because this scorecard does not direct anyone to collect primary data, it is limited by what's available. We selected countries that were known to have decent data already there, but it would be a challenge to complete the scorecard in a country without existing data. Further, because this scorecard was completed only through desk reviews, we would recommend enhancing the data collection through key informant interviews and focus group discussions as appropriate. Secondly, while we conducted the analysis through local consultants, the scorecard really can and should be administered through participatory approaches. You could work with stakeholders to jointly identify data sources, conduct additional data collection as needed, and even to analyze the results. Finally, from the consultants and the report outs from the presentations at technical working group meetings, the results from the scorecard really were useful for stakeholders. They hadn't seen this kind of analysis compiled in one place for them before, and it provided a new lens that can be used for advocacy and policymaking. So we're moving on to the Q&A component of this session. And so while you all think of some questions, I'd like to ask my colleague, Beth Rotok, who was instrumental in helping to develop this scorecard and is HP Plus's gender lead. What was your main takeaway from working on this activity?
Yeah, thanks, Alyson. For me, I think the big takeaway from this activity was how valuable tools with indicators like scorecards and gender markers are to help us define in concrete and measurable terms what we're trying to achieve. So gender and governance are two fields that are just full of jargon. And the term gender is often used as shorthand in the literature by programmers, policymakers, donors, by all of us. But the term itself doesn't really say much. And this became evident when we were doing our literature search to develop the scorecard. There wasn't, a set list or a nice list of gender and governance indicators that we could pull from. And so the process really forced us to think through in practical terms what we meant by gender and governance, what is kind of the ideal state for integrating gender into governance, and then how do we measure that? And the reason this is important is because it then sets us up to develop concrete and actionable recommendations that I think without this process, without this tool, wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I fully agree with it. It was really, that was really challenging, right? To try and parse out what we actually meant. That's why I started the question. What were we talking about? Any other questions or comments? And while people are still thinking, Beth, if I can ask you another question, other than funding, which is always a challenge, right? What do you think are the primary challenges to addressing any of the gaps that this scorecard may identify?
Yeah, so, funding is obviously important, and this, addressing any of the gaps, making any changes wouldn't be possible without funding. So I think sort of an interesting question might be, why is it difficult to get the required resources, the funding, but also the human resources and the technical expertise in order to address the gaps? And, allocating those resources means that decision makers must see value in gender, in integrating gender into governance. And unfortunately, our experience shows that in many countries and many contexts, gender is not prioritized. So even if we have excellent data and evidence around the around the governance gaps, unless decision makers see the intrinsic value of gender equality, or at the very least, the instrumental value of how gender equality can help to achieve improved family planning outcomes, we're not going to see meaningful progress. So the scorecard can be used as a tool to help identify the gaps and priority actions. But for me, I think the real work will begin with the advocacy that follows. And advocacy can be a long slog. It's difficult to find the champions, form alliances, and garner the commitment to advance these gender equality goals. So that's kind of what I think are the main challenges.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I fully agree. And as I mentioned in the previous session, obviously the quote unquote ease or difficulty of advocacy will also depend on that jargon issue, right? And how well we can make things easy to understand for as many people as possible. And so I might ask the others on the call, do you all see, and totally frankly and honestly, do you all see a potential use for the scorecard as I've presented it so far, or what have you heard would make it more useful?
I'll just chime in. This is Courtney again.
Yeah.
I think it's really useful in that understanding and knowing and having whatever evidence there is about where we are and acknowledging where we are is fundamental to moving forward. And I think one of the things that, and I'd be interested to hear the experience on this is, psychologically, the acceptance of knowing where we are and how you've found in terms of the experience of the groups, the governments, et cetera, that you worked with, their acceptance of the results.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So when we initially started the activity, it really was to just develop the scorecard. And so the application of it was really more of a testing it, right? Because you can't publish a scorecard without having tested it, right? So we hadn't really planned on doing an in-country dissemination of the results from the outset. But as the consultants were working on it, and they were doing most of the work through desk reviews, but I would say that all three of them did feel the need at a certain point to validate what they were finding. As they were doing these validation conversations with various stakeholders, there was interest in, well, can you present the whole thing at like a working group meeting or a session or what have you? It sounds like this would be really helpful. And so we weren't able to get it together in Tanzania just from a timing issue. But for Rwanda and Senegal, they went and presented at various working group meetings, and they were definitely interested in the results. And as I said, they really hadn't seen the information compiled in this way. And so this is also why I recommended at the end that one of the lessons learned is that while we didn't apply it in a participatory way, it really could be, and that would be best for local ownership of the results. And I was explaining in the previous session that I can absolutely see the establishment of a short-term task force where you set up a committee that, or not even a committee, but a subgroup within that task force. One group is going to be reviewing the state indicators, another one is going to be looking at the civil society indicators, et cetera. So I could see that really contributing to that uptake of the gender, of these results, right? The other interesting factor, and then I have to wrap it up. But the other interesting factor is that the diversity of resources that the consultants had to pull on to answer the indicators just goes to show how far we need to go in making gender governance data easily accessible. And that's really it. It's just not easily accessible, even in the countries that have gender data. So it was a fascinating exercise. So at this point, I want to thank you all for attending the session.